everybody. Thank you so much for being here. My name's Ellie. I'm one of the co-directors of the LC-ALDF Student Chapter. And today is our first event in our online symposium. So traditionally, the Animal Law Review has a symposium one day in the spring, but due to COVID and the online nature of things, the Lewis and Clark Animal Legal Defense Fund has teamed up with ALR to put on symposium events online all throughout the semester. So the symposium is At the Crossroads, Fighting for Change in an Interconnected World. And today I'm so happy to introduce Cami Hoffman and Professor Hessler, who will be discussing burnout and tips for confronting it and dealing with it. So Cami Hoffman is in the San Diego-led Raven, a youth activism group, the Raven Corps. The Raven Corps is a nonprofit organization that supports youth activists in anti-oppression advocacy for animals, people, and the planet. Since working with the Raven Corps as a resource development intern, Cami has joined the Raven Corps Board of Directors and became the first ever youth director. Through working with the Raven Corps, Cami has had the opportunity to speak out about the toll of animal agriculture at climate strikes, school, and several outreach operations, all while advocating alongside her fellow Ravens. Before joining the Raven Corps and today, Cami has been involved with local, social, environmental, and animal rights activism. She also volunteers at several farm animal sanctuaries in California. And we're so happy to have Professor Hessler with us, who is I just got to notice my internet's unstable. Can you guys hear me? Okay, hopefully. So Professor Hessler is a clinical professor at Lewis and Clark Law School. She is the first ever faculty member hired to teach animal law full-time in a law school. She received her JD from the Marshall Wythe School of Law at the College of William and Mary and her LLM from Georgetown. She is the director of the Animal Law Clinic and the Aquatic Animal Law Initiative, as well as a faculty advisor for LC-ALDF and the Animal Law Review. Professor Hessler co-authored Animal Law in a Nutshell, Animal Law, New Perspectives on Teaching Traditional Law, and the amicus brief submitted in the US v. Stevens and Justice v. Vircher cases. She has written numerous law review articles and teaches and lectures widely across the US and internationally. She is currently working on a new book, Aquatic Animal Law. So I'm so pleased to welcome you both. We'll start out with a presentation from Cami and then Professor Hessler, and then Q&A. So throughout the presentation, please drop any of your questions into the Q&A form. And with that, we'll get started.
Great. Okay, let me share my screen. Can y'all see this?
Yep.
Cool. All right. Well, first, I just want to thank a few people. Firstly, Claire. She's technically my boss, but most of all, she's a very dear friend and a constant source of inspiration. I would not be here if she hadn't put in a good word for me to be on this panel. And Professor Hessler, I'm honored to be speaking alongside you. I've heard great things, mostly from Claire, and I wholeheartedly trust her judgment. And I know that I'm going to learn a lot from you today, and I thank you for that. And Ellie and Miranda for being such a big help in the process of preparing for this, and to all of you for coming today. All right, I won't spend too much time on who I am because Ellie just did a pretty whole recap of that. But yeah, I'm the youth director of the Raven Corps. I use they, she pronouns. I'm studying journalism and environmental justice at Western Washington University. At least that's the plan so far, but who really knows? And I have the privilege to volunteer at farmed animal sanctuaries. And I just want to stress that point because it's going to be pretty integral to what I'm talking about today. And just a little disclaimer, this might shock you, but I'm not actually a professional in mental health or animal behavior or anything that I'm about to discuss. But what I am, like the rest of us, is a lifelong learner, or maybe I should say unlearner. And what I'm sharing today is entirely based on personal experience and things that I've observed while navigating the worlds of advocacy and self-care. And I've by no means reached the end of this exploration. And I went back and forth on whether or not I wanted to share like my mental health struggles, but I quickly realized that I definitely should, because not sharing, I feel like, would just further the stigmatization of this topic. And I've found that vulnerability is pretty much always uncomfortable, and as such, it almost always guarantees personal growth of some kind. One of my friends likes to say that we grow through what we go through. This is a case in point. And hopefully my experience can serve as sort of a framework to better understand why self-care and animal advocacy cannot and should not be separated. And a content warning / spoiler alert, eating disorders and certain disordered behaviors will be mentioned, but nothing too specific. On that note, here's some memes. These probably look familiar, or you've probably seen something similar floating around the internet in 2020. And they're sweet and all, but I think they point to a larger theme of this pandemic and how it's brought many of us much more closer to non-human animals than we have been before. And given that, it raises the question of how can we strengthen our relationships with them, and how can we nurture ourselves in doing so that we can build resilience within our own advocacy. And this is what I hope to address today. So like many of you, I'm sure, I've had a natural affinity for non-human animals my whole life. I've adopted dogs, fostered a whole host of species, volunteered a good chunk of my time for our non-human kin. I basically live in this perpetual state of like, okay, this is good, but what if there were more animals? And across the board, my life is just so much better and richer when I'm connected with fellow animals. And that's very much the foundation of this story. So what you see here is what I call the road to fatigue. It illustrates the path from starting advocacy to the point of burnout. It's not based in cold, hard data by any means. It's just a pattern that I've observed in myself and in others within animal advocacy. And it's worth noting that these stages, they're not always mutually exclusive or linear. They can overlap, jump around, and if you have like a chronic illness or something else going on that impacts your ability to advocate, exhaustion is likely to come up much more frequently. So in the spirit of vulnerability, I'll use some personal examples for each stage here, and I encourage you to self-reflect along the way and consider where you are, if anywhere, in this process. So the first stage is when you're introduced to an injustice. You learn and engage with the subject, issue, or problem. My deep dive into animal advocacy started just before I went vegan, and I'll spare you the details of how and why I went vegan because it's very unremarkable and there's like thousands of other stories like it. But my introduction to this arena started with orcas, thanks to this little film called Blackfish. Maybe you've heard of it. It's kind of a big deal. And from there, I went on a research spiral, and more issues of animal cruelty were brought to my awareness. And it was a lot to take in, especially as a high school student who was sort of simultaneously coming to grips with the urgency of the climate crisis. And that leads to stage 2, where naturally I put those feelings of outrage and sadness to use, and I got active. So in this stage, you feel inspired to act, you mobilize, you participate in activism for the cause. And for me, this process started with volunteering at animal sanctuaries because it felt important to maintain a direct connection with who I was fighting for. And I participated in all the different modes of activism And about a year or so into this, I found the Raven Corps and started up a corps here in San Diego. And that's definitely the closest that I felt to my authentic self in my initial advocacy exploration. And that like youth camaraderie was a real game changer. But all those intense emotions that sparked this activism did not just go away. Getting on the streets helped, but that can't and shouldn't be your only means of dealing with these feelings. So during this stage, it's vital to keep a close eye on your coping mechanisms, especially if you have a history of relying on maladaptive ones like substance abuse, self-harm, or disordered eating. And given the overwhelm of this tumble into advocacy and other things that were going on in my life that are beside the point, my brain decided to latch onto something that it could control, which was food and my body. And so restricting food became a reliable way to numb out my feelings, both the good ones and the bad ones. Which leads to this stage of compulsion. This is when guilt becomes the main drive in your advocacy and you become less connected to your values. And there's two main ways that I've noticed this can happen. You're either too emotionally invested in the cause or you're emotionally divested. So you're either haunted day and night by images of animal suffering, or you're just perpetually numbed out and going through the motions. Or sometimes it's somehow both. For me, it was more numbed out. I was hell-bent on attending as many local actions as I could, and I still did care about the cause, but mostly it was just all coming from this sense of obligation. And as I was becoming more embedded in the culture of mainstream animal advocacy, my anxiety and depression and restlessness just skyrocketed, and there was this constant sense of inadequacy. And my subconscious mind wanted to numb these feelings, and food restriction presented itself as a way of accomplishing this. Not a very good one, but we're going to get into that. And so I attempted to control my body by obsessing over what I ate, how much I ate, and how much I exercised. And it took me a long time to realize that these behaviors were, in fact, coping mechanisms for unhealed wounds. I had developed an eating disorder called anorexia nervosa without even realizing it. And it took me even longer to accept that I needed help to heal from it. And I think it's safe to say that mainstream animal advocacy is fairly anti-human, and I had unwittingly classified myself as an enemy. And the logic was that animal suffering was the only thing that mattered, and my mere human problems didn't matter. So that's kind of a surefire way to get into this last stage, which is exhaustion. And it can be known by other names like compassion fatigue, which Professor Hessler is going to get more into. So as I grew more distant from the cause, the animals, my mental health took a big hit. It's kind of like this advocacy yo-yo where you become entrenched in the cause and then you get overwhelmed and you pull away, and it just keeps on bouncing up and down. And the further that you stray from your values, the less sustainable your activism becomes and the more likely you are to burn out. So after years of disregarding my own needs, my mental and physical health were at an all-time low, and my eating disorder was at an all-time high. And from day one, the therapist that I was seeing, she urged me to get help from a higher level of care. And I resisted every single time. I minimized my problems. I believed with a conviction that they didn't really matter, especially in comparison to animal suffering. And that thinking landed me in residential treatment for my eating disorder. And I just want to note that this is it's a pretty extreme example of what exhaustion and burnout can do. And so I just want to say that regardless of the outcome, exhaustion is completely valid, and it's something that you want to deal with sooner rather than later. So that whole recovery process was and continues to be very challenging, but there have been several aha moments along the way, and a great majority of these moments have centered around animals, which brings me to my main point of this whole presentation, which is that connecting with animals on a deeper level can fuel our advocacy both internally and externally. So the next part of this presentation, I'm going to share 4 stories that highlight animals as teachers and some universal lessons about self-care that certain individuals have helped me realize. And this is by no means a new concept. Cultures across the world, particularly indigenous peoples, have been doing this since time immemorial. And hopefully these lessons won't be new to most of you. More than anything, I'm hoping they can serve as like gentle reminders or like exciting new ways of connecting with self-care practices. And I'm using storytelling because I think it combats the objectification and instrumentalization of animals, and it creates this profound respect and appreciation for animals as the individuals that they are with individual experiences. And that sort of inherently carries and propels our advocacy. So first up, we have Cherry. She is a resident at Sail Ranch Animal Sanctuary, and not gonna lie, she is one of my best friends. She was found abandoned on the side of a road with really, really bad case of mange. I always say if you picture like the dry, gray, cracked surface of a desert, that's what her skin looked like. And she was rescued, restored to health, and she continues to thrive at the ranch today. Now, Cherry, she's one of those girls who can be pretty selective about the people that she tolerates. And I'm fortunate enough to be someone who she doesn't totally hate spending time with. And she almost always comes up to me whenever I'm in the vicinity, demanding attention in the form of belly scratches. And it was really hard to be away from her during the months that I was in residential. But when we reunited, it was like nothing had changed. She came up to me, she was giving her high-pitched snorts, she flopped over for scratches, and we just stayed there for a while. And it was as if she were saying, see, this is what you've been working for. And that, in that moment, she helped me to hang on to the roots of the matter. And by that, I mean, the roots are that big overarching why. Why are you struggling, and why is getting through that struggle important to you? It's important to stay connected to both of these things, and one way of doing this is by assessing what genuinely makes you feel fulfilled with no strings attached. Like for me, when I'm with Cherry, I'm not at all concerned about what other people are doing or how my actions stand in comparison. I'm just there, I'm present, and I'm giving compassion towards this living being. And now I know this event is sort of about like animal advocacy, but I would be remiss if I didn't stress the importance of intersectionality, because single issue focus and self-care, I don't believe they're very compatible or sustainable. So it's important to ask yourself, how are you being oppressed, and how are you being an oppressor? Like my eating disorder, for example, it was very much influenced by sexism and fat phobia, and I was being an oppressor by conforming to that, which dramatically impacted my animal advocacy. So the system, it's not just some amorphous blob that's around us. It's something that exists in and is perpetuated by individuals. And if we want to dismantle one form of oppression, we have to untangle ourselves from the entire beast, not just one facet of it. Modern activists like Christopher Sebastian, AFCO, Isaiah Hernandez, they're all great examples of what this work looks like within the animal rights movement. Next up, I feel like this slide mostly speaks for itself, and I could literally go on for days about this girl, so I'll try to keep it short. This is Tilly, and she's why I believe in love at first sight. I met this old girl at a local city shelter when I was in a really dark place, and she instantly lit up my world. When I first saw her, she looked dejected, lost, demoralized, and her body was riddled with tumors. Now, no animals deserve life in a pound, and as I came to realize, this girl definitely needed a human companion to thrive. Or maybe I was just projecting. Either way, she needed some help. And as soon as I took her home, the life came back in her eyes, and she loved with a vengeance. She demanded attention with the most irresistible puppy dog eyes. She would flop over for tummy rubs at every chance she got. And her transformation is a testament to the fact that we are not meant to be alone in activism or in healing. In joining the Raven Corps, I became part of this community of youth activists that shared my passions and interests. And Tilly really helped me see value in that. My connection with Tilly is a large part of what powered me through residential treatment, and she passed away shortly afterwards, and her lessons are still at the top of my mind every day. All this to say, collective care is an integral part of self-care and vice versa. We cannot heal our communities if we cannot heal ourselves. And so this is Theo on the left. But before I get into that, I do have one term that I'd like to share, as you all are probably feeling this in the context of the pandemic and or the climate crisis. And it's called apocalypse fatigue. On resilience.org, they identify it as the exhaustion of having to make endless moral choices when they don't seem to make a difference. It's always having to worry about every choice when other people's lack of concern negates your efforts. So it's hard being a decent human in a world that works against you. And we have to acknowledge that if we really want to do this work in the long term. So while I was in treatment, my therapist once told me, when we stress, we regress. And if ever there was a textbook example of this phrase in action, it's my boy, Theo. Theo, he was rescued from a lab here in San Diego back in August. And all I knew about him was that he was in the lab for 6 years and that he may or may not be prone to seizures due to the testing that he went through. Fortunately, and perhaps miraculously, he hasn't had any medical issues thus far, but the psychological trauma of being tested on really took a toll on him. At home, he was understandably scared of new people, older men in particular, and he wouldn't eat, he refused to lay, sit, or even step on any surface that was even remotely cushioned. And he was terrified of leashes, collars, harnesses, really anything that would attach to him. Fast forward to now, and he greets people with a wagging tail, still has some issues with older men. He jumps up onto my bed for snuggles, tears around the yard with our other dogs, and becomes this wriggly ball of joy anytime it's mealtime. But there are days where something triggers him and he withdraws. He may go into a fit of trembling, he might cower away from people, or just overall become afraid of everything again. It's like one step forward, stress hits, and it's 3 steps back. And it's the same with people. When you're stressed, you're bound to regress. Accepting and acknowledging that is the first step in moving through it. And animals are particularly great teachers in this arena because they are the masters of intuition. They rest, they eat, sleep, and play, all when they feel like it. They perpetually live in the moment, and in doing so, they encourage us to do the same. And yes, some of these acts are selfish by definition, But so long as these acts do not harm others, there's really no harm in doing them. All acts of kindness are valuable, no matter how hard you try to quantify and rank them up against others, including acts of kindness for yourself. All right, so this is my last story. This is Lindsay. When I was a high school sophomore, don't ask me how, but I stumbled across a pig on Craigslist. The lister said that the pig was either free to a good home or she would be shot and sold. Now, given that these people were willing to kill this girl, I did not like whatever their definition was of a good home. I didn't want to find out what that might be. So I jumped on it and reached out to local farm animal sanctuaries. And after finding one that had room for her, I got a few people together, we rented a U-Haul trailer, and we went to go pick her up. We severely underestimated the situation. Lindsay, she clearly had very little positive interactions with humans. She put up such a strong fight that we had to come back the next day with more supplies. And it took a while, but we eventually managed to corral her into the trailer. And when we arrived at our destination at the sanctuary, Lindsay's welcome was no less stressful than the entire process of getting her in the trailer. An excited pig or two tried to greet her, and she was not having it. She lashed out and she bolted and hid away for the rest of the evening. But in the days and the weeks to come, she made friends and began to settle into her new life, one of community, love, and care. So think of this story as kind of like an asterisk to that first story of finding your why. Here we ask, what are you fighting for really? Like for me, this is what I dream of, a world where those who have been oppressed are offered justice and compassion, and everyone is given a safe space to heal. One time I was talking to my therapist about how I'm still not sure what I want to do with my life or what I want to study. I feel like I should be more on top of things, yada, yada, the usual like quarter life crisis. And then she said something along these lines. She said, what I see when I look at you, past all the should do's and have to's, is just a girl that wants to live on a farm and hug pigs. Instant breakdown. She really just hit the nail on the head and made me realize that, like in this movement, it's very easy to get caught up in the immediate suffering and lose sight of our long-term hopes and aspirations. And Lindsay, she was a reminder to one, take myself less seriously, and two, that there's enormous value in all of us holding on to our dreams as we navigate being an advocate in this world. So as my sort of call to action, I invite you all to consider an animal in your life and ask yourself, what can you learn from them? Or rather, what are they trying to teach you? And see where this exploration takes you, and then maybe encourage a human friend to do the same. And because healing really is a form of liberation in and of itself. So thank you. And if you want to get in touch with me, here's some of my info.
Thank you so much, Cami. That was amazing. Professor Hessler, whenever you're ready, you can share your slides.
Okay. Hopefully they're visible. If not, somebody can let me know. So yeah, I'm delighted to be invited to this panel. Thank you so much to Miranda for organizing the symposium and for Ali and Connor and the whole LCA-LDF team, and Cami, obviously, thank you for that fabulous presentation. I've heard about your work for a long time, and it's lovely to see and sort of meet you this way. And a shout out to Claire Howe, as Cami said. So Claire, for the folks who don't know, is not only the founder of Ravencore, the founder of other work and good work on her own, and she brought us Cami. And I'm mentioning this simply to say, sometimes people think that their work doesn't matter and that a single person can't do a lot. So in addition to all the work that Claire's doing, she brought us Cami in. So you can already see the legacy effect, right, of the work that people are doing and that all of us here have the ability to do. And I want to echo what Cami said, to thank you all for attending, given what everyone has on their plates these days. I appreciate your attention to these issues for yourself and for your colleagues in the movement. So it's important that we do a recognition of where we're at here in Portland, and here at Lewis and Clark, we honor the Indigenous people on whose traditional and ancestral homelands we stand. The Multnomah, the Cathlamet, Clackamas, Tumwater, Watlala bands of the Chinook, the Tualatin Kalapuya, and many of the other Indigenous nations of the Columbia River. We can learn a lot about respectful relationships with animals and with one another and the planet from these historical and present day communities. And we need to acknowledge that. As an overview, we're already facing so many challenges, and the challenges of burnout, compassion fatigue, and vicarious trauma are challenges upon challenges, but it's important to sort of tease them out and think about them separately sometimes. So that's what I'll do for a little bit, and then how we respond to challenges. And if we have time, we'll do a couple of quick things at the end to help us, in addition to what Cami said, sort of move forward through these challenges. So in talking about these challenges, I want to also reiterate what Cami said. We're not professionals in the sense of this kind of work. We're professionals in other senses of the word. And doing this work is important to all of us, but we want to encourage everyone to seek the professional guidance and assistance that they need. Our goal is to offer you some space to think about these issues and think about what works for you. There are so many resources available. I tend in my presentations to do a lot of facts and figures. I'm not going to do that this time. There's a lot of information available and people can find what's useful for them. A lot of statistics about how many people experience burnout and what it's like in the legal profession in particular, and animal advocacy as well. I think people coming to this have a sense of that, so I've decided not to focus on that. I will say, however, that for the folks here who are involved in the legal field, there are increasingly requirements from state bar associations about mandatory CLEs and other ways to manage these kinds of issues and to be aware of the resources available and how we're engaging. So just to check those out. So a couple of quick definitions. So Cami's already talked about burnout. And so thinking about how that looks, and so just a quick sort of backdrop to that is, so additional sort of definitions are the emotional, physical, and mental exhaustion caused by excessive and prolonged stress. And that's something that we all face in our work. Also feeling overwhelmed, emotionally drained, and unable to meet constant demands, losing interest in and motivation for the work, or feeling helpless, hopeless, or that you have nothing left to give. So as I said, Cami addressed a lot of this. And I just want to highlight that the legal work that we do, the school work that we do, the animal advocacy work that we do can lead to burnout all by themselves, and certainly in combination, which is something a lot of us are facing. And that doesn't even address the pandemic and some of the other issues we're dealing with. So vicarious trauma is the emotional impacts of exposure of trauma that others are facing. So witnessing pain, fear, or terror, which is something that we witness one way or another. Secondary trauma results from hearing or learning about the trauma of others. So I'm putting these, you can sort of tease these apart if it's speaking very specifically. I'm putting them together because they kind of go together for the purposes of this conversation. So when we experience one way or another the trauma of others, it traumatizes us, and it's something that we need to attend to, because if we don't attend to it, it ends up causing problems to us and makes us less effective as advocates for others. And so we spend countless hours learning about this harm, right? And so that is a significant source of vicarious trauma. And as Cami said, we can feel shame or doubt or guilt or anger. We can respond to this stress in lots of ways that are not particularly helpful to us in our lives and to our work. And so there are many sources of this trauma. So some people, I think, sometimes think this isn't so bad or that's not so bad, but thinking about the cumulative impact of all the sources of trauma that we experience is important, and that accumulation can be really, really strong and have a deep impact. Compassion fatigue is sort of the impact of dealing with the vicarious or secondary trauma, right? So it's this emotional, physical, mental exhaustion experienced by those caring for or helping others. So it's experienced by caregivers or helpers of people or animals, right, who are suffering significant emotional, physical pain or suffering. It's this compassion fatigue can be made worse when we put the needs of others before our own too often. So it's ideal, right, that we want to experience and help other people by figuring out what they need, but doing that too much, too often, and not attending to our own needs is problematic. Not having appropriate boundaries. We need to know when is our downtime? When do we turn things off? As Cami referenced, that sort of feeling of guilt that we always need to be making thoughtful and appropriate decisions in a world that makes that challenging and negates the decisions that we're making is really challenging. So figuring out how to manage that, what kind of boundaries, what kind of protection do we put and build for ourselves? And having an overdeveloped sense of responsibility, right? That we always have to be helping, we always have to be doing something for our colleagues, for the animals, for our communities. And so the advocacy community tends to reward these behaviors, and it fails to sufficiently support healthier approaches. And by advocacy community, I mean that generally, not just the animal advocacy community, but social justice work, because this is the work we're called to do. This is the work we find important. And so we just want people to keep doing it and doing it more and doing it better. There are never enough resources. And so we have to be aware of both sort of how we're working in these communities and how the community itself sort of needs to get better in these situations. And there are obviously disproportionate impacts. Some people have more resources, people have more support, more guidance, more better coping mechanisms. So thinking about on whom these problems fall more seriously is something also that I think we need to do as a community. Okay, in particular, we have animal advocacy challenges, and I'm not going to spend a ton of time on this, but referencing a little bit of what Cami said and building on that. So we have in the movement, right, we have additional to all the other problems that we know we're facing. We have this infighting and lack of cooperation sometimes. We have sexism, racism, sexual harassment, this boys club mentality. One of the studies found that this was a significant problem for a number of people. We have something called the martyrdom culture, and this is you are not important, the animals are important, and so you have to be a martyr for the cause. You put your own issues, your own needs to the side, because that's what good people in this movement do. And we have a hero worship culture, right, where if someone does something good for the animals, they become this hero, and sometimes we then see that they can do no wrong, and we want to be those heroes, or we have this. We build people up in these ways rather than say everyone has a role in this. Everyone can contribute to fixing these problems, and you don't have to be at a certain stature to be doing that kind of work. And we have a significant lack of training, and with that, we should say resources as well. So these are problems that the animal advocacy movement faces. They're common problems for the social justice movements as well. As are sacrifice, long hours, low pay, emotional distress, things that we already know. And so these things are kind of built in, if you will, to our work. They're hardwired, and we need to take a step back. That's part of the benefit of this conversation, to say, okay, these are problems in addition to addressing the problems the animals are facing that have brought us to this movement. We have to do this work internal to the movement so that we can help the animals, so that we have healthy people doing sustainable work. And so one of the studies that I've reviewed recently has said that failure to mitigate burnout could be one of the most formidable barriers to sustaining social movements. So this is big, right? I also want people to recognize, if you feel like, well, so I'm tired, I'm exhausted, I'm dealing with some of these things, but I still have to do this work. This is important for us to figure out how to fix for ourselves, but for the movement itself. So if you can't prioritize your own needs to get some assistance or develop additional coping mechanisms, then do it for the movement, because it's important for the movement too. So I know that sometimes when talking to people, folks are like, I don't even know where to begin. I don't know what to do. I can't even describe all the things that are wrong. And certainly in the experiencing the year that we've all just experienced, and the world stage brings us many, many problems. And so in a way, it would be surprising if we didn't feel overwhelmed. So what do? So acknowledging that is a great place to start. It makes sense to feel overwhelmed. It's okay to feel overwhelmed. If we feel overwhelmed all the time, that becomes a problem, and it makes it harder for us to do our work. So what do? What are our responses? So here are a few takeaways. If you don't sort of remember anything else, you can sort of boil down some of what I'm saying into these few takeaways. So especially for those of us in the legal field, I find that it's an easier sell, if you will, an easier way to talk about this is to say that we need to take this obligation as a serious professional responsibility. So doing this work to sustain our work is a serious professional responsibility. It makes it possible for us to continue to do the work that we have committed to doing. And so we need to take this very, very seriously. The second one I just enjoy. So from the Nap Ministry saying rest is a form of resistance. And so obviously we know rest is important. It refreshes us. It helps us rebuild our strength to do the work. But they went on to say, because it disrupts and pushes back against capitalism and white supremacy in particular, they called these things out. And this is another way of sort of engaging what Cami calls us to do to recognize the intersectionality in all forms of the work that we're doing. So paying attention to doing something that you enjoy is one way to reset and refresh. And sometimes that involves working with animals. And so I want to sort of highlight and sort of support what Cami has been saying. And we recognize too that connection, that personal, that touch, that we sometimes get such refreshed perspective from, can be harder to do during the pandemic. Some folks have animals within their homes. Some folks don't. Some folks are able to help out at shelters. Some folks aren't. So recognizing that something that might have been a coping mechanism is harder to do right now is important. And recognizing that continuing to engage with the animals can be a source of new stress, right? So if we're doing the work at a shelter or a sanctuary where we're dealing with the challenges that the animals are facing, we need to recognize the ways in which it does refresh us and the ways in which it does stress us. And it's useful to adopt the framing that Cami and others have used so that we don't instrumentalize animals. We're not just using them so that we feel better, right? We're learning from them. They're teaching us. We're helping them. And obviously we want to help them, but being attentive to that relationship. Why is it I'm engaging with this animal in this moment is important to be aware of. And clearly doing something that you enjoy, I want to call out that doing things outside of the movement, outside of law school, we tend to sometimes frame our world a little tightly. And it's great that we have community, we have support, and we want to engage with that world. But it's useful as far as getting different perspectives, as far as just getting a break from the same kinds of conversations to do things outside as well. And building those communities, right? Just rely on your community when you need to, your friends, your families, your colleagues, in the movement, out of the movement. That it's important to recognize that you do have some of these supports. People want to help you be successful and happy. And so rely on them. And to focus on the positive things in your life, right? Even if that means simple things on a day when things don't seem like anything is going well. Just knowing that you have other people on the journey with you sometimes is something you can be grateful for. So there are positive things. It's great that we pay attention to all the difficult things and that we're working to fix them, but there are positive things to focus on as well. Okay. So one of the ways in which to engage in this conversation is self-care, as Cami said. So the challenges that we have come from the nature and the style of our work, right? And this is a very significant problem for legal professionals. So again, I'm not going to go into all the statistics, but within the legal profession, we have higher rates of substance abuse, disordered eating, depression, anxiety, and all kinds of other challenges that we need to be attentive to, because people who come into the legal profession tend to be people who, the same kind of people who go into any other profession. So it's the nature of our work and the way in which we work, the stress we add onto ourselves, and how we manage that stress or don't manage it, which leads to these outcomes. So we need to be thoughtful and figure out ways to stop having that recur over and over. One of the problems is that many of us are overachievers, right? We want to do more all the time. We want to do more for the animals. We want to do more for more animals. We want to take on more issues. And that's great, but overachievement has its limitations. And so we also tend to do it in the frame of social justice movements, which are pretty typically not well funded. And so we're trying to do more with less, and that is just not sustainable. And we have empathy, which brings us into this conversation. We actually look for the suffering. And so that means we kind of live with it. We're focusing on it all the time. And we need to manage our exposure there, especially recognizing that we can't immediately stop all the suffering that we're exposing ourselves to. Working long-term is what we need to be thinking about. We also push perfection, right? Someone who does something wrong kind of gets called out for doing something wrong, even if they're trying to do good, recognizing that that's not possible for us all to be perfect all the time. It's good to acknowledge mistakes and handle them when they happen. Failure is actually a way of learning, and we need to make room for our own and others' improvement. Self-care so as I said, a personal and professional obligation. So we shouldn't take on more than we're capable of handling, even with assistance, and we should acknowledge those limits. We shouldn't become debilitated to the point where we ignore or mishandle responsibilities we've undertaken. And if we get to the point where we need help, we have an obligation to seek it. And that's personally for ourselves and for our work. So remembering rest is a part of work. It's not something we do extra on the side when we have time. It's a part of how we manage our work. And if we think of it that way, it gives us a little more permission to get what we need. So making a plan is one way to cope with all of these things. Just writing down, these are the things I need to do, is a way to manage those things. And you can, it's sensible to be worried about these really large to-do lists that we make for ourselves, right? And there are apps available. There's lots of different ways to manage this material. But sometimes putting it in a place means that we don't have to worry it. We're not carrying it in our heads or on our shoulders. And that takes a lot of emotional energy. So begin a plan, start somewhere, right? It takes some of the stress off, and like, okay, I know I'm going to do something in 2 days. I don't have to worry about it maybe right now. I can worry about the things on my list to do today. And sometimes trying to figure out what's on that list, like you made dinner and you did the laundry, those are things that need to be done, and they need to be sort of incorporated in your general plan of the work that you have to do. They're important. So that's good. And you can make adjustments to your plan. The other thing I encourage everyone to do is to build in some downtime in their plans, right? When they're thinking about all the stuff they have to do, build in some time for fun, for relaxation. So you already have skills. You already all have coping mechanisms. And so think about, what are the ones you're using, what's working, what's not working, what do you need to adjust? And again, recognize we don't act alone. So we're interdependent, and that's good. It can be at times stressful. Managing those relationships and recognizing those challenges is important. Also know that seeking help is a skill. I mean, we can learn from Cami's story and her situation, and from others that we know in our own. It takes effort, energy to figure out when to ask for help, who to ask for help, how to ask for help, how much help to ask for. Those are skills that we need to hone and develop. And we need to plan that this is not a one and done. Any of the things we're talking about, right? Our work is long-term. We're not going to solve all these problems overnight. And in fact, some things are going to get worse, and we have to build resilience so that we're ready for that, so that we can have the emotional fortitude to keep going as things get worse. So thinking about what are the problems that we're dealing with explicitly, so that we can figure out how we best want to manage them, is a really good tool. So what are the things we're worried about? What are the concerns of other people or that we're taking on? What is working for us? What is working for others? And thinking again about the good things. So in your own work, see the good things that you're already doing. Notice that it's helping. Notice when someone says, I really like that talk, or you said something good in class, or I learned something from you. Or notice that, your dog loves it when you come home and rub his belly, right? And he's happier because you're there. So look for these other things, again, inside and outside of your work. Try and know the things that make you happy when you're having a down day, right? If it's the funny cat videos, right? Or whatever it is, so that you can go to it for just 5 minutes, sort of zone out and get in a different space and actually change your body chemistry when you smile and when you relax and just de-stress. We have people around us who are here to help us, and we should know that, rely on them, learn from them. And we're not stuck in any of the work that we're doing. We're not restricted to how things are or have been. We can work to change those things as well as these larger things that we're working on. And so give yourself permission to do that when you need to do that. So I always say every step in the right direction is a good step. We want to run, we want to get to the goal, right? But we have to get there somehow. And so a step in the right direction is good, one step at a time. We may take small steps even though we have big goals. But one of our big goals should be wellness, right? For ourselves, for our communities. If we can't even imagine that that's important, we're never going to get there. So we need to think about how we get there. So this was one of my coping mechanisms as I went through chemotherapy and I lost my hair. This was something I could do that actually made people smile. They didn't feel bad for me. They didn't feel sorry for me for having lost my hair. I was able to turn that sort of negative thing into a positive thing. And so there are lots of ways we can do that in our own lives. So I know we're running low on time. I'm going to ask people just for maybe 30 seconds to focus on this photo. Ordinarily, when I lead meditations, we do a more traditional thing. I'm just going to talk as you focus on goat, sheep. Know that they were rescued. Know that they're happy. Know that they've chosen this relationship. They're exerting their own autonomy. They're deciding. They're making decisions. They're free to do that. They've overcome the challenges of their past with the help from wonderful people. And this is a wonderful moment that they're able to share because people have helped them do that. And if you can just take the tone down, right? Take the stress, relax for a minute and smile about just this photo. That's just one example of what you can do for yourselves to enrich, to refresh and nourish yourselves. So I'm just going to ask you to think about what you can do from here, right? So giving you some space to think about today. What's one thing you can do today that would make you smile? One thing that makes you happy? Simple things, not doesn't have to be a big thing. So a walk, a call with a friend, reading something not for work, for pleasure, right? Turning off the computer, eating something nice, taking a nap, whatever it is. And recognizing truly what it is that works for you. For some people, it's go talk to people. If you're an extrovert, for introverts, it might be not talking to people, and that's okay, right? Figuring out what that is. But think about just for a minute what might be possible for you today that would make you feel better, right? If you're already going to go get some food, try and do it from a struggling vegan business. And then you're happy, you've gotten good food, you're helping them. Just say something nice to somebody, right? Simple things that you can do. So I'm asking you each to think of one thing that you can do today to make yourselves smile, to make yourselves happier. And know that this is not selfish. To maintain or regain wellness, it's vital for your sustainability and for the work that you have decided is important that we're all working on together. And so I'll stop there and thank you. And hopefully we'll have time for some questions and discussion.
Thank you so much, both of you. Your talks were so moving. So I'd like to open it up for questions. We have about 6 or so minutes. So if any of you want to just throw your questions into that little Q&A button, hopefully you guys can see it. We'll start asking those. So I have a couple questions. How, and this is to both of you, how do you feel like the pandemic has exacerbated burnout and fatigue, and what actions have you taken to mitigate the effects of pandemic fatigue?
Cami, do you want to start?
Sure. One thing that comes to mind for me is I feel like in this pandemic, we've all really been forced to sit with ourselves, which is not something that a lot of people are used to or comfortable with. And that in and of itself can be a very draining and exhausting process in addition to everything that's already going on. So I think in that sense, the pandemic has definitely increased burnout. Something that I've been doing to kind of combat that is just journaling. I love writing, and it is kind of a way that I can connect with just like my authentic self and thoughts. And yeah, it just really helps me with staying grounded and feeling more comfortable in those moments where I do have to sit with myself and my own thoughts.
And I would just add quickly that, yeah, the pandemic has been a huge problem on top of all the problems that we're dealing with. And so one of the things I've done is to look at the additional sort of burdens, if you will, that it creates and see where there's some potentials there. And by that, I mean, so these kinds of Zoom chats, right? And teaching online, it's not my preferred way. I like being with my students. I like, hugging them when they're sad and that sort of thing. And I can't do that. But I'm recognizing that I hadn't paid as much attention as I wanted to about accessibility issues, right? And so this gives me another way to engage with people, another way to think about how people can come, even to conversations like this. I noticed just looking at the participant list, we have people from all over who wouldn't otherwise be able to be joining us today. And so that's a good thing. And I'm trying to commit. I'm a person who doesn't always take all the advice I offer. And I recognize that, and I still work on that myself. And so one of the things I'm committing more to do is disconnecting and not like working on my computer as I watch TV with my family at night, but just stopping that and being with them and, more walks and talks and just trying to be present, as Cami said, not just with myself, but with them. And trying to establish a little bit better work-life balance. It's almost harder during the pandemic, but gives me more chance to work on it, right?
Okay, we have another question similar to what I was going to ask, because I think not like knowing the advice and knowing the skills is one thing, but putting it into practice can be a lot more difficult. Someone asked, how can we be leaders in the movement to help support others and normalize self-care and community care? And they also added, so grateful to Cami and Kathy for this presentation.
Thanks. Well, I'll start and then Cami can add. I think, again, this is a way that we can try to remind ourselves to be gentle with ourselves, even as we engage in this work, right? We're going to make mistakes. There's going to be backsliding, right? And so reasonable goals, right, are always helpful. So one thing. So in order to be leaders in the movement in this way, pick one thing, just one thing, right, that you want to change. And then start working on that. Get other people to help you work on that. You don't have to do it all by yourself. And recognize some days you're not going to even meet your own expectations. Say it's learning, right? Okay, so what made it less likely? What made it hard for me to meet that goal? What's going to make it easier for me to meet the goal tomorrow? What can I do? And you just keep going, right? And so there's no point in beating yourself up when we don't meet these goals, when we don't achieve the things we know we want to achieve, because that just gets in the way. It's more guilt, it's more anxiety, it's more frustration. Go in knowing you're going to make mistakes. Go in knowing it's not going to be perfect, but give yourself like a reward every time you get it right. Yay. Like notice that, celebrate that, right? Have people around you who are supporting you on this journey so that you're not on it alone. And just know that it's going to be a bumpy ride, but it's better when we have friends with us.
Yeah. And I'd add, like within like activism and advocacy, just like making that need for rest and like regularly tuning in with how you're feeling and where your energy levels are at, making that a normal part of like your communities. You can play a huge part in doing that, because I'm going to shout out Claire again, because our like working relationship is like founded on just being transparent and open with each other. And so in doing so, we can regularly just check in, like, where are you at? How are you feeling? That way it's never like a surprise if one of us needs to just like take time off and like get our heads on straight. And so creating that sort of community of care, I think really goes a long way. And even if you don't see it reflected initially, it's bound to have an impact on the people around you if they see you sort of leading by example and taking care of yourself. I think that just sort of inherently encourages them to do the same.
And I'll add another thing really quickly. I think people worry, so they want to be available for friends and community members, right? They want to be a safe place. They want to be able to ask people how they are, but then sometimes they're worried that they don't know what to do with the answer, right? And this is not about being a professional. If you think someone needs help, listen to them, right? Be available and then suggest help, right? You're not someone's therapist, but you can be a friend. And so I think it's really useful to know that you shouldn't be taking on too much when but just listening to people is sometimes all they need. They just need space to vent, right? And a sympathetic, empathetic ear. And that's hugely valuable. And if it gets beyond that, beyond your capacity, if you're struggling with how to deal with what you've been hearing from your friends, then you can get help too, right? But you can suggest that they can get help more than just having friends. So don't let that stop you from being available and listening, because that's really important. And then suggesting people get help when they need it is also really important.
Thank you so much. Sadly, we are out of time. Before everybody goes, I just want to tell you about our upcoming events in February. On February 5th from 12:10 to 1:10, the same time, we're going to have an informal Zoom session with Professor Hessler to talk about the presidential elections, the state of our democracy, and animal advocacy. So maybe if you can tune into that, we can also address any questions that weren't covered today. And on February 10th, 12:10 to 1:10, we are going to be joined by Lauren Ornelas from the Food Empowerment Project to talk about food justice, breaking interconnected systems of oppression. So it's going to be really great, both events. Hopefully you can all attend. Thank you so much again to Cami and Professor Hessler. This was awesome.
Thank you so much for having me. It was
Thanks.
a pleasure.
All right, we'll see you guys all later.